Good afternoon to Ephs everywhere. My name is Kadir Forbes. I'm a Williams alum, class of 2015, and I have the pleasure of serving as your MC for today's lecture. A little more background about me. I currently serve on the Society of Alumni Executive Committee. I have served as a class agent and as a founding co-chair of the Williams Men of Color Network. I was also a psychology and theater double major at Williams, so I'm very excited to learn about the psychology of first impressions in today's lifelong learning lecture, Professor Jeremy Cohn. On behalf of Williams College Alumni Relations, I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining the third of 5 lectures in this series. These 1-hour virtual lectures are scheduled throughout the fall and feature Williams faculty and expert alumni from a variety of academic disciplines speaking on different topics. You can find the recordings of past talks as well as other virtual offerings at alumni.williams.edu/virtual. As a few reminders before we get started, if you have any questions during today's talk, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen at any time. We'll have dedicated time for Q&A at the end, but you can feel free to submit your questions at any time. Please reserve the chat as a space to engage with the community and share any reflections or comments you may have. Remember to select all panelists and all attendees in the chat dropdown so that your message can be seen by all. And with that, I would like to introduce today's speaker, the man of the hour, Professor Jeremy Cohn. Jeremy received his Ph.D. in social psychology from Cornell University in 2012. Woo, go Big Red. He spent a year as a visiting assistant professor at Williams in 2012 and 2013, followed by a postdoc at Yale University from 2013 to 2015. Jeremy rejoined the faculty at Williams as an assistant professor in 2015. His research focuses on understanding the nature and operation of implicit processes, including especially implicit attitude change. We are very excited to have him with us today to speak about life around the digital water cooler. Thank you, Professor Cohn.
So thank you so much for having me and for inviting me to give this talk. And a special thank you to everyone in Alum Relations who organized this event. It's been great to see such a robust turnout, so I'm really looking forward to this. All right, so a quip often attributed to Mark Twain says that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its boots. Now, ironically, it turns out that Mark Twain never said this, but that, of course, has not prevented it from traveling halfway around the world. So you've already had your first piece of exposure to misinformation in this talk. But it has a kind of quality of truth to it, doesn't it? Because, of course, we've long been concerned about the possibility that we sort of find ourselves in a sea of misinformation, getting exposure to fallacious rumors and gossip and hoaxes and conspiracy theories, and maybe even more nefarious intentional attempts to deceive us. And indeed, variations of this particular quote, sometimes attributed to Mark Twain, sometimes attributed to other authors, has been in circulation since at least the 19th century and maybe even variations of it earlier than that. So this certainly isn't a new thing that we're concerned about. But still, I think that we can agree that things are different now. We have exposure now in the digital age to perhaps more information than we've ever had available at our fingertips at any moment in history. But at the same time, we also now have more exposure to misinformation than at any time in our history. And so the question then is exactly what kinds of effects, The question then is exactly what kinds of effects does this have on our ability to come to accurate understandings of what's happening out there in the world. Okay, so we used to acquire information from shared authoritative sources on the evening news. Now we find ourselves siloed off into our own particular corners of the internet and our own particular social networks where we can selectively cultivate and carefully control exactly which information we get exposure to, which of course will influence then how much we attend to those pieces of information, how much we consider them, and then maybe ultimately also how much we accept them. And in fact, a very recent survey in Pew suggests that we now are in a scenario in which many people get their first exposure to a news story through social media. In fact, the majority of consumers get their first exposure through these kinds of social media companies. So 42% suggest that their information, the first place where they hear about a news story, 43% comes from Facebook. But also we find examples of even things like YouTube or Instagram having sizable percentages of people getting their first exposure to that information in these kinds of contexts, places that do not have filters or particularly strong filters for credibility or authenticity. So we're perhaps more susceptible than at any time in our history to misinformation. Gossip is not something that's new. It's not a new phenomenon. But when we look at what happens in the digital sphere, that now can saturate a social network very, very rapidly and can reach many, many thousands or maybe even tens of thousands of people before the truth can ever get its boots on, right? And so intentional attempts to misdeceive, or to deceive us, like fake news, for example, are scenarios in which the information can travel widely and be shared thousands or perhaps tens of thousands of times before a fact checker can ever catch up. And in fact, in a very recent attempt to understand rumor transmission on Twitter, this particular group of authors finds that, sort of alarmingly, false information can permeate much more widely and much more thoroughly through Twitter than true information. And also alarmingly, that information seems to diffuse the social network much faster than the truth. And so my lab studies the science of first impressions, where those come from, and importantly, how we can change them, what kinds of information or evidence we can get exposure to that can lead to impression updating. And so the thing that I'm particularly interested in with respect to these kinds of issues in my own lab is thinking about the question of whether this fact that we have more exposure to misinformation at any time in our history, whether that can have some sort of important influence on our ability to form accurate impressions of other people. And in particular, the question that I'll try to address is, can our mere exposure, just getting exposure to misinformation, have some sort of ability to influence us, independent of whatever your conscious beliefs about it may be, whether you think that it's true or false? Okay, so the latest political scandal drops. We don't know whether it's true, it's of questionable authenticity, but does the fact that we've merely considered it, does the fact that we've had exposure to it have some sort of role to play in the kinds of impressions that we develop? Can it have these kinds of pernicious sorts of consequences, even despite our conscious sort of endorsement of it? Okay, and so this is a matter of some debate among psychologists. And in particular, what many psychologists would contend is that the extent to which this is possible, that it could have these kinds of pernicious influences, is driven in part by the kind of impression that we're discussing. So psychologists certainly agree that when we learn something about someone that is potentially false or questionable or misleading, of questionable authenticity, we can potentially reject its influence on our conscious feelings about somebody, our explicit sorts of evaluations of them. So the things that we learn around the water cooler, they can certainly influence how we feel about our coworkers. There's no question about that. But they generally only do so to the extent that we believe that they are credible, that we believe that the information is true. But psychologists have long been interested in the question of whether impressions can be influenced by more automatic or spontaneous or unintentional sorts of processes. And these may show different kinds of learning characteristics relative to more consciously held explicit ones. So on the one hand, you have a kind of explicit evaluation of somebody. We measure those using self-report. This is the process that you go through when you are asked, what do you think about, say, Obama? Do you like or dislike him? When you answer that question, you do it deliberately, and you do it intentionally, and you do it slowly, and it's controllable. You can provide answers that are potentially not how you actually feel. Implicit evaluations, on the other hand, are those that we measure using more indirect methods. We don't directly ask people how they feel about somebody, instead using more unobtrusive sorts of measures. And I'll show you a couple of examples of what these things look like over the course of the talk. But importantly, these kinds of reactions are much more spontaneous and unintentional. They're rapid and efficient, less controllable. And these kinds of reactions happen within a fraction of a second of exposure to somebody's face or in considering them in some other way. Okay, so I'm just going to very quickly flash two faces on the screen for you here, very, very briefly, and we'll see what kinds of impressions you have of them. Okay, so here's one face, very, very brief. Here's another one. Now, in addition to whatever conscious feelings you have about those faces, whatever you self-report, you may be agnostic at this stage. You may say you don't have enough information to be able to decide how you feel about them. Or maybe you have already come to some feelings about whether you feel positively or negatively towards these two people. But importantly, in addition to whatever conscious feelings you have there, we also have that kind of gut level positivity or negativity that kind of leaks out of us in a fraction of a second of exposure to their faces. And so importantly, these kinds of spontaneous reactions do not need to be the same as what we report consciously or explicitly. They very often dissociate from one another. And so the task of my lab is to try to understand where these kinds of implicit evaluations come from. How do they form? What kinds of evidence can change them? And these kinds of reactions may very well be susceptible to the mere exposure to particular kinds of evidence. Okay, so let's assess your implicit evaluations. I promise you this is usually a lot more dramatic if we were in a room together, but humor me anyway. What we're gonna do is I have two categories at the top of the screen. On the left side, you see insects. On the right, you see flowers. In the center of the screen, I'm gonna give you examples of words that correspond to insects or flowers. If you see an insect, just hit your left hand. If you see a flower, hit your right hand. Okay, so here's an example of one together. That's a flower, so I'm gonna hit my right hand. Okay, now let's do a bunch of them. Here we go. So right, left, right, left. Okay, piece of cake. Now the game is the same, but now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you a series of words related to goodness or badness. Same concept, just categorized as you see them on the screen. Okay, so for this one, we would do left. Let's do a bunch. Okay, now a little bit more complicated. Notice on the left-hand side, we have two different types of categories. We have insect words and bad. And then on the right, we have flowers and good. Okay, so now just a quick response. If you see this word, you would now say left because that's an insect. If you saw a bad word, you would also say left. Flowers and good would be on the right. Let's do a bunch of them. Okay, now we're going to flip the categories. So up at the top there, you see on the left now is flowers and insects are on the right. Let's just do a couple of those. So now this would be left. Okay, and now the key. Let's look at flowers and bad on the left and insects and good on the right. This one here would be a left. Let's do a bunch of them. Okay, now I suspect that you probably found it quite a bit harder to do the last task than it was to do the earlier one where flowers were paired with good. And notice that what that means essentially is that your ability to categorize these words is partly a function of what it's paired with. And that is because you have a kind of natural association between flowers and goodness and insects and badness. And in order to override that and provide a response that is inconsistent with that kind of categorization, it takes just a little bit more time. And so what we can do is we can use this as a kind of indirect measure to sort of reveal your implicit evaluations of these two constructs. We can look at the extent to which you are able to respond quickly when flower is paired with good, and compare that to the reaction times that you have when flour is paired with bad. And we can use that to get a sense of the extent to which you have a kind of automatic gut level positive sort of feeling towards flowers and insects. And so basically what my lab studies is, where do these kinds of gut level responses come from? What causes them to form and what causes them to change? And what causes them to now leak spontaneously and unintentionally out of us once formed or once changed. And easily the most predominant theory for the dissociation between implicit and explicit evaluations is that the ingredient that makes up an implicit sort of evaluation or impression is an association. It is essentially an association that has been strengthened in memory between the attitude object, whatever that is, and positivity or negativity. To the extent that that is sort of slowly accruing information in the environment that suggests that flowers are good, we then come to associate those two things in our minds to the point where it acquires features of automaticity, so that just merely encountering the flower automatically calls to mind the positivity or the negativity. Okay, so to introduce you to how that works, imagine that I invite you into the lab at 25 Stetson Court in Williamstown, and I bring you into the implicit cognition and evaluation lab, and then I lower the lights a little bit, and then I flash a bright red light, and then I shock you. Sorry, it's for science. Okay, then what I do is I shock you 1,000 times by flashing the red light and then shocking you. Again, sorry, for science. Now, notice that on the 1,001st trial, if I were to turn on the light, then you would show all of the physiological indicators that would suggest that you anticipate that you would be shocked. In short, you would have learned that there is an association between those two things. They have become strengthened in your memory. And importantly, I could suggest to you, you know what, this time for this 1,001st trial, I'm not going to shock you. But nonetheless, when I flash the light, you would still show all of those physiological indicators. I could even convince you, I could say, look, the shock machine is unplugged, it's safely sitting in the corner. You would still show all of the same patterns. And that's because that association has acquired these sorts of spontaneous and unintentional and uncontrollable sorts of features through that kind of strengthening in memory. Okay, so if this is the case, then it suggests that implicit and explicit evaluations differ not just in how deliberate or conscious they are, or how spontaneous and unintentional they are, but also on the cognitive processes that cause them to come into being. On the explicit side of things, we argue that these are formed on the basis of what we call propositional processes, those that are rule-based inferences or beliefs. On the other hand, though, for an implicit evaluation, we suggest that those operate on the basis of primarily associative sorts of learning. And this is the explanation for why these two things seem to dissociate from one another. Now, if that's true, if that's the way that implicit evaluations work, if that is the ingredient that makes them up, is this kind of associative learning, then it has at least two really important implications for the learning characteristics and the extent to which these can easily form and change. The first of these implications is that once you have one of these kinds of automatic sorts of responses, it really ought to become heavily entrenched. It ought to become difficult to dislodge. So once that strengthening in memory has occurred, it shouldn't be very easy for us to disrupt it because it's acquired these features of automaticity. And the other one that I really want to hone in on in particular today is that they become irresponsive to truth value in their development. Because associative learning unfolds in the absence of any kind of conscious acceptance or endorsement, that means that it'll form even if we don't believe the information, even if we don't think that it's true. So if I take the concepts of Obama and terrorism, to the extent that you do not endorse that idea, even if that's true, if I pair these together 1,000 times, you'll still nonetheless develop that kind of automatic association between the two, because it's not susceptible to this kind of conscious influence. Okay, so let me hone in particular on that one. I'll show you evidence for each of these two claims. And so what I'm going to suggest to you is that both of these claims are incorrect. And in fact, this is not a good explanation for how implicit evaluations form and change. And I'll look at evidence that challenges each of these two assumptions about how they work. So on the truth value side of things, notice that if I say bacon, you already know what to say. Eggs immediately comes to mind. Now notice that that could happen even if you're a vegan. You don't need to endorse the pairing in order for that to have developed. And it's entirely because the environment has crafted those sorts of pairings for us. We understand that they're associated with one another, independent of how we feel about it or a conscious endorsement of it. And it's hard to control that kind of cognitive accessibility of those two concepts in memory. If you think of one, you're very likely to think of the other. And the same may be true if we call to mind a person and think about automatically positivity or negativity. It's irresponsive to those sorts of influences. So in more technical language, what Peters and Goronsky suggest is that explicit evaluations are the product of a belief-based learning process, which qualifies the evaluation implied by object valence contingencies by the perceived validity of those contingencies. In other words, when you think about things being paired in the environment, explicitly we can reject that influence, and we can have some sort of role to play for whether we think that the information is true or not. Implicit evaluations, in contrast, are thought to be the product of a contingency-based learning process. It's a strengthening of associations in memory, which encodes contingencies independent of their perceived validity, and hence is sensitive to the dominant valence associated with an object. It can develop even if you think that the information is false. It will still come into being through that sort of exposure. Okay, so this may sound very familiar to you because in a lot of ways what we're describing is essentially classical conditioning. So remember that Pavlov pairs the ringing of the bell with a food reward, and the dog develops a kind of automatic salivating sort of response to that stimulus. And maybe the worry from a sort of implicit cognition sort of perspective is that just like Pavlov's dogs, we may be beholden to the information we encounter in our environments. And that could happen even if that environment is polluted with misinformation. There's lots of untrue things that are being circulated out there in the world on social media. And the question is, can it influence you if you learn those regularities in the environment, even independent of your beliefs about its truth? Now, what my colleagues and I over the last several years have attempted to argue is that this is not a good model to explain how implicit cognition operates. It's not a purely associative kind of process. And we have at least two reasons why we think that that is potentially true. The first of these is that when we look at a measure like the one that you completed earlier, the flowers and insects version of that measure is what we call an implicit association test, or IAT. There are a number of other ones as well, including one that you'll see later in the talk called the affect misattribution procedure, as well as many others that have been developed since about the late 80s or so. The thing about those measures is that they are not process pure. It might seem as though what they're tapping into is a kind of associative sort of learning that could be taking place, but in fact, all of these measures have at least some associative components and some propositional components. So when we measure that kind of implicit response, we're not getting a pure readout of a person's belief, sort of associations with these concepts. In fact, there could be some role for those fast learning sorts of propositional sorts of reasoning, rule-based kinds of mechanisms. And the other sort of problem with this kind of purely associative model is that it implies only one kind of associative learning. It implies a kind of gradual accrual of these sorts of pairings in the sort of contingencies in the environment that results in a gradual, slow strengthening of those associations. But one of the things that we've learned over the last couple of decades is that associative learning is not a monolithic construct. It isn't one thing. It's actually many things. And many of those processes exhibit a lot of the features of automaticity, but they aren't necessarily that kind of slow learning sort of mechanism. So it does turn out to be true that if you want to look at things like what we call semantic learning, that is, I want to learn the association between doctors and nurses, it turns out they occur a lot of the time together. And I can learn that association. And it does turn out to be the case that that is a slow learning sort of mechanism. It is a kind of gradual accrual of experiences that suggests that that kind of pairing is valid to us. And once you've acquired it, it is heavily entrenched. It's hard to undo that kind of understanding of that co-occurrence with very little information. It requires a lot of experiences in the opposite direction that suggest that they shouldn't go together, for example. But there are lots of associative processes that do not show those patterns. And so, for example, when you look at fear learning, in fear learning, we can learn that something is dangerous, and we can very often do that in a single trial, right? You have exposure to a vicious Rottweiler. It doesn't take very many trials before you develop that kind of conditioned fear response in response to that particular vicious dog. And it takes a long time for it to go away. So there's a fast learning sort of model here, but then a very slow extinction. And instrumental learning is another type of associative learning in which we learn to pair a behavior of some kind or some action that we engage in with an outcome of some kind. So we learn that there's a relationship between those. And this kind of learning is able to develop relatively rapidly, but it's also very flexible because the outcome, the pairing between behavior and outcome can often change. The outcome doesn't always occur. And so we need to be able to learn and revise our understanding of these things relatively rapidly. And so this kind of pattern, this kind of learning shows a different kind of set of learning characteristics relative to these other models. Now, the thing is all of those are implicit processes. All of that is associative learning, and yet they show very different learning characteristics. And that suggests that the extent to which implicit evaluations capture each of these kinds of associative learning, even if it is an associative sort of mechanism, could suggest that there are different kinds of learning characteristics. And that would open the door to potentially rapid revision of implicit responses, and also maybe some sort of responsiveness to truth value of that information. Okay, so I'll show you a couple of studies on each of these sorts of questions, challenging the associative model on each of these fronts. So the first question that I want to address is, are they heavily entrenched, or can they be changed very rapidly? Once you've acquired that automatic response, is it possible to change it very quickly? And if it is the case that you can do that, what kinds of information seem to do it? What properties of evidence are necessary for that to unfold? And then actually, let me show you some evidence for that first, and then I'll introduce the second point. And so one of the things that could potentially change the sort of track on which you're running with your implicit response, the trajectory of your implicit sort of responses towards somebody, is a type of information that we call diagnostic in character. And what we mean by that is that you learn some kind of impression inconsistent evidence that is particularly reflective of the person's true nature or character. That is, it reveals something about the kind of person that they really are and the kinds of things that they're likely to do in the future. When information has this property, we call it diagnostic. And our proposal is that diagnostic information is the sort of information that can cause very rapid changes in your implicit responses, not just how you feel explicitly, but also in that kind of rapid, spontaneous sort of response that you have. So let me just show you one example of a study that supports this kind of rapid revision. In this study, what we do is we have participants develop an association with a guy named Bob. And notice that this captures all of the same properties as that red light sort of theory, right? So instead of pairing red lights with shocks, we're going to pair Bob with lots and lots of positive behaviors, a total of 100 behaviors in the first initial learning phase of the experiment. So they learn that Bob helps a friend review for a test. He buys tickets for his parents' anniversary. He is helping old ladies cross the street, and so on and so on and so on. And the purpose of this is simply to create that very strong association in memory between Bob and positivity. Then what we do is we measure people's implicit responses towards Bob to make sure that that has been successful. And I won't show you what that looks like just now, but you'll see an example of what this measure looks like in a second. Then what we do is we expose participants to their 101st piece of information about Bob. And this one is different. It is qualitatively different in its flavor because it has been chosen to be highly diagnostic. This is not just any sort of information that you can sort of put alongside all of the other things that you've learned about Bob. This is something that is very clearly reflective of the kind of person that he is, of the kinds of things that you could imagine him doing in the future. And then we measure people's implicit evaluations again. And the question is, what kinds of effects does that have on people's not just explicit, but implicit evaluations? Now, notice, if the red light theory is true, if this is really just a purely associative kind of model, if this is all just classical conditioning like Pavlov's dogs, then this piece of information really shouldn't have too much of an impact. We already have 100 pieces of positive information. We're adding just one more to that pool of behaviors. It shouldn't cause that much change. But what we find instead is that this is enough to essentially fully reverse the implicit response. People start out very significantly implicitly positive towards Bob, and then 30 seconds later, immediately after encountering this behavior, they show implicit negativity. Okay, and so what that suggests then is that rapid revision is possible. And we've shown in a series of other studies that when features capture or when behaviors capture this kind of diagnostic property, that seems to be the thing that does it. You can have a single trial and show these kinds of patterns without any additional sort of counter conditioning in order to be able to cause the switches. Okay, so now what that suggests, though, if we're thinking about the effects of, for example, fake news, is that when a political scandal drops, even a single exposure to it could potentially be enough, not just to change how we feel explicitly, but maybe also implicitly too. And so the question then is, can we be shaped by that? Can we cause rapid revision, even in scenarios in which we don't necessarily know that the information has some sort of authenticity or not? And so in this study, what we looked at is how fake news can cause these same sorts of rapid revisions. And so in this study, we have participants consider Jack Black. It turns out people really like Jack Black. They like him explicitly. They say they like him relative to other celebrities. And they also show those same patterns implicitly. And the way that we tap into those implicit feelings in this particular study is with a measure that looks like this. Okay, so this is, I'm not sure if this will be able to display fully accurately for you on your screens if there's a bit of a lag, but in close, quick succession, you'll see the following three things. I'll try that one more time just so you can get another shot at it. Very, very rapid on the screen. Three things happen. First, a picture of Jack Black's face, then a Chinese pictograph, and then noise. And participants' task is to rate the Chinese pictograph while ignoring the prime, ignoring the face that they saw earlier. And their task is to say, what do they think about the pictograph? Do they think it's more pleasant than average, or do they think it's less pleasant than average? And it turns out that because this happens in such quick succession, whatever conscious or whatever sort of gut level feelings you have about the prime, whether positive or negative, tend to be misattributed to the pictograph itself. So if you see a really ugly insect before you see the pictograph, you have a tendency to say that the pictograph is less pleasant than average. And if you have a flower of some kind, then you'll show a tendency to evaluate the pictograph, not the prime, the pictograph, as more pleasant than average. And so this is called an affect misattribution procedure, or AMP. And we can use that to get a window into how people feel about Jack Black unintentionally. We're not asking them directly what they think about him. Instead, we're asking them what they think about the pictograph. And they may not even understand that there's been an influence of this misattribution between the prime and the pictograph between them. Okay, and then we compare that to a set of neutral celebrities, of which Jonah Hill was one, Sylvester Stallone was another, et cetera, et cetera. And so then what we can do is we can basically take the proportion of times that a person says that Jack Black is more pleasant than average, or sorry, the pictograph is more pleasant than average when Jack Black is the prime versus other celebrities, to get a kind of readout of how implicitly they like him relative to others. And so what I'm showing you here is just the metric of implicit preference. This is just a different score between how they felt about Jack Black and how they felt about the other male celebrities. And what you can see is that prior to exposure to any new information, people like Jack Black implicitly. They show an implicit positivity towards him above the 0 point. Okay, so positive numbers here mean more liking of Jack Black. Negative numbers here mean more liking of the other celebrities. Okay, then what we do is we expose participants to a theoretically diagnostic piece of information, but it turns out it's not true. So we use this fake news exposure where we craft a story that looks like it's come from some sort of unfamiliar news site. And we suggest that Jack Black has been accused of domestic abuse. And then we have participants read the story and consider it, and we tell them they'll answer some questions about it a little bit later. And then we're going to just have another metric of their implicit responses between them using another AMP. And what you can see is, as a kind of testament to the power of fake news and its potential for very rapid revision of our implicit responses, it turns out that participants immediately become implicitly negative towards Jack Black after this exposure. They've turned from being implicitly positive to implicitly negative, even though the amount of time that's passed in between these is maybe 30 to 45 seconds. And they have presumably a huge amount of history and understanding about and knowledge about who Jack Black is. Okay, and so this is enough to cause these kinds of changes. Okay, so what this shows us then is that rapid revision is possible, and the question is, how much does the truth of the information actually matter? Okay, so that suggests to us then that diagnostic information is really crucial for these kinds of rapid changes, but it might make us more susceptible to misinformation to the extent that it captures this property of diagnosticity. Okay, now let me turn to the question of what effects believability can have, what kinds of role there can be for truth value of the information. How much does whether you consciously endorse information or think that it might be true have an influence on how much you respond to these kinds of information? And so in this particular study, what we do is we play the same game that we were playing before, where we expose people to a novel person that they've never seen before. But now we're going to try to manipulate the authenticity of the information. And the way that we did that is by taking advantage of a fact about rumors, which is that if you just describe something as a rumor, if you say, this is a rumor that I heard, but here's what it is, people think that rumors and word of mouth transmission are unreliable. They don't believe them as much. They think that they're less likely to be true as a result. Okay, and so what we're going to do is we're going to first fashion an implicit response that is particularly positive, and in this case it was 50 behaviors instead of 100. And then what we did is we gave people a diagnostic exposure, but importantly we manipulated how reliable it was. Okay, so one group of subjects learns that Kevin is accused of a heinous crime, but in the reliable source condition, that's coming to you from police records. It's sort of unimpeachable. It's clearly true. Then in the other case, we suggest that it's coming to you as a rumor. It's coming to you from your friend Molly, who has some sort of ulterior motive, potentially, which is that there was a sour breakup and Molly is friends with the person that Kevin broke up with. And the question is, she shares that information with you. And so now that doesn't mean it's not true, but it does mean that maybe there's a potential for her to want to share something that could potentially challenge Kevin's impressions. And so what we do here is we look at before and after exposure to this evidence, what kinds of effects does that have on your implicit responses? In the pre-exposure version, this is the scenario where both groups have learned 50 positive pieces of information about Kevin. And of course, they show an implicit positive response, just as we would expect. In the reliable source condition, notice that people have learned something that's very reliable and it's diagnostic. And in that case, people show very rapid changes in their implicit responses. They suddenly do not like him implicitly, very quickly. Now, the key question, though, is what happens in the rumor condition. Now, remember, if Peters and Goronsky are right, if this is unqualified by perceived validity, then this should look the same. It shouldn't have any different sort of exposure. It's extreme negative information. That's the contingency-based information. It shouldn't cause those kinds of changes to differ at all. But in fact, it does quite a bit. In fact, what we see here is there's much less movement in response to this particular behavior. Now, key thing to notice is that it's not the case that the rumor has no effect. It clearly does. It's clearly causing them to be more negative towards Kevin. But the important fact is that that is qualified in some ways by whether they think that the information is potentially of questionable authenticity or not. Okay, and then in a second experiment, what we did here is we just used the same story that you saw earlier with Jack Black, but now what we do is we give people the knowledge that it's false. We tell them that it's untrue, and we manipulate when we tell them that fact. Okay, so everybody gets exposure to the fake news, But in the experimental condition, we let them believe that it's true. In the control condition, we let them believe that it's true. In the experimental condition, we disabuse them of the fact that it may be true by telling them that it's incorrect immediately after they learn it. Okay, and so before we measure the implicit response. And then in the control, we just leave them to their own devices to see how they feel about it. Okay, and so what you see here is, first of all, they feel good about Jack Black. They like him initially. When you learn that it's fake afterwards, notice that you're not sure whether it's true or not. We haven't told you anything about its authenticity. People respond to it, just as we've shown before. The single exposure is enough. But here's the key question. What happens if you know that it's false when you get the exposure immediately afterwards? As soon as you encounter it, we tell you it's wrong. And now notice that they don't show any changes in their implicit responses. And that suggests to us that perceived truth value actually is a pretty crucial ingredient here for the kinds of changes that people are showing. Okay, and then in the last few minutes, let me just show you some new work that we've just conducted looking at how these patterns change over time. Okay, and so what I've shown you so far is we immediately look at people's exposure to fake news, and then we immediately measure their implicit responses. But that, of course, is that could change over periods of days or weeks or months. And it's important for us to understand the kind of long-term sorts of implications for these sorts of exposures. So this is a study design where we did exactly the same thing as you saw earlier. This is the manipulation of whether Kevin is accused of something terrible as a function of reliable information or a rumor. And notice that in the first two cells, you see the same pattern we saw before. If you learn something really terrible and you think it's true, you show really quick changes in your beliefs about him. And if you learn that it's a rumor, even though it's the same information, you show much less change. What happened 7 days later, though? All we did was we just followed up with participants and we asked them again to fill out the AMP. We just asked them, what are your implicit responses towards this person? And what you can see is that, first of all, although there is a little bit of movement in response to the amount of time that's passed, people are still pretty implicitly negative towards Kevin. They've held on to the information. It stuck with them. And in the rumor condition, there's actually no movement at all. They show exactly the same implicit responses 7 days later as they did immediately after exposure. And that suggests to us then that there is some sort of potential for long-term sorts of interventions that could potentially influence whether and when people show these kinds of changes in their implicit responses. This is the identical sort of design. All we did is we took the participants who were exposed to the fake news about Jack Black, and we followed up with them 2 months later. Now, at the end of our first experiment, we told everybody that the story was false. It's just a manipulation of when we told them. And so what you can see here is that, first of all, when they didn't know it was false, they show the pattern that you would expect. They show movement. And then, of course, if they know that it's false, there's no movement. Now, is there any worry that 2 months later, they may have forgotten that fact of whether it's questionable or whether it's not questionable? Could it stick with them anyway? And in fact, it turns out that that's not the case. In fact, they show the same implicit responses 60 days later as they did immediately after they learned that it was false. There's no evidence that it stuck with them in any meaningful way. Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, we started with the idea that maybe there's a worry that we find ourselves in a sea of misinformation and we're getting inundated with things that are fallacious and that could be shaping our responses towards somebody. And there is some potential reason for worry there, because many psychologists have suggested that even if that doesn't have an influence consciously, maybe it does at the implicit level, sort of shaping you by mere exposure to these sort of contingencies in the environment. But what I hope these findings suggest to you is that actually those implicit responses are quite a bit more sophisticated than they might seem. So unlike Pavlov's dogs, the learning that is causing that to shape, whatever that is not really a pure readout of classical conditioning sorts of mechanisms. It's a lot more sophisticated and a lot more nuanced. We can see changes that are very rapid, even with a single trial of exposure in ways that are inconsistent with a classical conditioning sort of model. And we can see evidence that people's perceptions about the believability or truth value associated with the information can then have some sorts of important influences on how much change you show. Okay, and so let me just add 2 quick caveats to that more optimistic picture. The first thing that I want to suggest is that, of course, remember that it wasn't the case that when the information was questionable that we saw no movement, right? It was the case that even when it was a rumor, we did see some effects of exposure to misinformation in that case, or potential misinformation. And so in this, what we're seeing here is that there is some sort of role to play. There is some sort of evidence that people are showing responsiveness to this info. It's just that it's qualified by the amount that you believe it. Okay, and so that doesn't mean that we can fully correct for these kinds of influences of misinformation in these contexts. And then the other sort of caveat is a big one, which is that what I've shown you so far is that people's perceptions of the believability of information shape their implicit responses. But of course, those perceptions may very well differ from reality. And in fact, we know for sure that there are lots of ways in which people can come to beliefs that are not consistent with the actual credibility of that information. And so we know that if we can shape their perceptions of the credibility of the information, we can have some sort of influence on their responses, but we don't know necessarily how to shape those perceptions of the credibility of the information. Okay, so that's all that I had for today. A big thank you to Katie Flaherty, who is an alum. She's now in medical school at the University of Michigan in her first year. She was very seminal to essentially all of the work that you saw today. And Melissa Ferguson, who is my longtime collaborator, originally at Cornell and now at Yale. And then to the Implicit Cognition and Evaluation Lab here at Williams. This is the most recent in-person picture that we have. And sadly, it's a bit dated at this stage, but you can see all of the undergraduates who have been involved in all of this work. Okay, so I'm gonna unshare my screen. And as Kadir mentioned, we have a little bit of time for questions, so I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. I'll fire over to the Q&A window here and try to answer a few of those. Okay, so one question that came up is, does rapid revision happen in the opposite direction as well? So if you have a negative impression of somebody, can you turn it positive with some sort of diagnostic good behavior? That's a great question, yes. And it was something that we were very concerned about as well. So what we've done is we've done a version of the paradigm where you learn all kinds of negative things about somebody, and then we give you one diagnostic positive piece of information. And in this case, it was that Bob recently donated his kidney to a stranger. Very altruistic behavior. And it's the sort of thing that can influence your responses towards him potentially. And what we find there is a kind of valence asymmetry. So what you see is that there is a large amount of movement in people's implicit responses, but we do not see a full reversal. Okay, and so when you learn 50 negative pieces of information about somebody and then one diagnostic positive, what happens is they become less negative. They do not become positive. And so we see evidence to suggest that there is an effect of diagnostic information that certainly has some sort of role to play, but it has less efficacy and less effectiveness than when that information is diagnostically negative. And you can sort of get a sense of why that would be, right? So if you have a diagnostic sort of behavior that is negative, it's really easy to shed light on a person's character by doing something really terrible, right? It's a little bit harder to undo and sort of give up on all of those negative things that you know about somebody just on the basis of a single positive behavior. It may shed a little bit less light on their character. And so we see evidence certainly for this kind of valence asymmetry here. Okay. Okay, so somebody asked the question of, does repeated exposure to untrue information change how much this influences you? That is a wonderful question. It's so wonderful that we're actually working on that exactly at this moment. And so I have an independent study student, Angela Wang, who is basically looking at trying to understand how getting more than one exposure to the very same diagnostic story can shape how you respond to it. And so Angela is a computer science and psych double major. And so she is programming a virtual social media feed. And so we've adopted a platform that was developed by some researchers at Cornell where you can manipulate, it looks a little bit like Instagram, and you can manipulate all of the features on it and have people interact with it and those sorts of things. And then what we did is we have a sort of example of a feed that supposedly comes from a small town in Greenville, a town you've never heard of. And we're going to ask you to look at that feed and see what you think about it. and you see a whole series of like recipes from Greenville and local news, and you also see a local political scandal drop about the mayor. And what we manipulate is whether you get one exposure to that within the feed or 5 exposures to that within the feed. And there's some good evidence to suggest that repeated exposure to fake news can have some sort of important influences on the amount by which that you believe it. So explicitly, whether you think that it's true and credible, just having a repeated exposure can make you think that it's more likely to be true. And so we wanted to understand what kinds of impacts that might have both implicitly and explicitly. And interestingly, what we see there is that repetition doesn't do anything. It actually doesn't have any impact on implicit evaluations or explicit, actually, it turns out. There's only a minor effect of that in terms of the repeated exposure. They do have a tendency to say it's slightly more believable, but they don't seem to be showing any effects on how they actually feel about the mayor. And so this is something, of course, that we were very interested in and thought was important because this is a kind of thing that we encounter very often now, where a scandal that drops, a potentially untrue sort of piece of information is something that we don't encounter once. Oh, by the way, sorry. So, and then the manipulation of believability is we manipulate the source very similar to what you saw earlier, which is we convince them that the local newspaper is a propaganda outlet, it's sharing a whole bunch of salacious rumors, or it's a reliable source that's winning all kinds of awards for its reliability. So, and we see that that matters for how much change they show, and repetition doesn't seem to matter very much. Okay. Okay, so this is a question about how much your affective state can influence whether you see information as diagnostic or not. And so Ryan Buggy asks, is there any research about how your affective state affects whether or not you consider new information to be diagnostic or credible? So for example, if you read about something that makes you angry and then you read an entirely unrelated article presenting negative information about somebody, is there a difference in how you rate its diagnosticity credibility versus if you receive that information in a different state? Yeah, that's a great question, Ryan. And so the idea with this is just more generally the question of how much you can manipulate people's feelings about diagnosticity as a function of the time that they encounter it. So affective state seems like a really interesting one. We haven't actually explored that. So we don't have a good sense of whether that would have any sort of influence. But we have started to think about questions about how the way that you encounter that information could influence you, or the meaning that you ascribe to it. So we don't have any good examples of that kind of manipulation taking place yet, but I think that's exactly the right sort of question, which is basically, if we know that diagnosticity is part of the story for implicit sorts of revision, then the question is what influences diagnosticity? And the idea would be that there would be a whole series of things that would change whether you see something as influencing somebody's diagnostic sorts of traits or character. The most interesting one of these things that we've explored more recently is motivation. So the idea is that you have a tendency to want to believe that certain things are true about others or false about others. And the question is, how much can that serve as a sort of moderator or attenuating sort of effect on whether you see it as reflective of their character? So we have a version of the study where we expose people to the scandal just like before, but now we tell you whether they're a Democrat or a Republican. And then we ask you whether you are a Democrat or a Republican. And we look at the effects of your own partisan leanings in terms of whether you believe the information or not. We don't have a clear story there yet. We haven't figured out exactly what's happening with people's responses there, but it's a very good question for sure. Okay. Okay, this is an interesting one from Mary. Mary asks, has this research been shared with Mark Zuckerberg? Man, I'd love to. What can Facebook do? Okay, so this is actually something we've thought a little bit about. We haven't sadly spoken to Mark recently, but the question that this raised for us certainly is, what does this mean for intentional attempts to try to fact check and to try to resolve sorts of exposure or contamination of misinformation out there in the world, right? And so we actually wrote an op-ed for CNN Business Perspectives that I can send you the link for, where we talk about exactly this question. So the idea that, that we would like to argue for is that this actually suggests a kind of role for fact-checking. It suggests that that could be valuable and that it could lead to changes in how people respond to information to the extent that they believe us, right? So there's obviously a lot of wrinkles there in terms of who are the fact checkers and what kinds of, how that is conveyed to the participants and whether they believe us or not about what that fact checking shows. But at least what we know is that if we can convince people that this information is of questionable authenticity, then we know that that should have less of an impact at the implicit level. And so what this suggests for us is that mere exposure is not enough to do this, right? It's not going to be enough to have these kinds of pernicious effects. So then the question is, what can we do? What exactly is possible for us to achieve with that sort of fact checking? That's a great question. Okay, so I think we have time for one more question. Let me just quickly pull one here. Oh, I like this one a lot. So Laura Westphal asks, have there been any considerations for the separation of a person from their work? So for example, will we show worse implicit associations of a song if the artist is going through a scandal? That's a wonderful question. And it's very interesting, right? Because it suggests that you might have these kinds of associations in memory, even if we're arguing for a kind of propositional influence of diagnostic sorts of information, right? So you associate a particular artist or person with a song or with a piece of writing or with a piece of artwork or whatever it is, and can there be a kind of spreading of activation or sort of effects of that? And so we've done a couple of examples of things where we've tried to pursue that. One example of that is we looked at corporate sponsorship. So this was especially when Tiger Woods was imploding. And the question is, that information about Tiger Woods is clearly diagnostic and it clearly changed a lot of people's impressions about him. But the question is, does that affect how you feel about, say, Nike as a function of how they respond to the scandal and their just sort of like mere association with him? And what we find there is that we did a version of a study where basically we exposed people to a fictional corporate, a fictional celebrity from Australia who is sponsored by some organization. And then we look at their attitudes towards the person and the organization. And then we learn that that person is caught up in a horrible scandal. And so the idea there is, what does that do to the attitudes towards the celebrity? What does it do to the attitudes towards the charity, in this case, that he was associated with? And what you see is what we saw before, which is that there's huge amounts of changes towards the celebrity, but there's also a little bit of change towards the corporation itself, particularly if you don't have any sort of information from the corporation about how they feel about the scandal. So they can kind of get caught up in it. That's pretty wild, right? Because it suggests that there is that kind of associative learning that's still there. And it suggests that our argument about propositional influences is also not pure. It seems that learning is partly a feature of associative sorts of mechanisms, and it's also a feature of propositional learning as well. Yeah, great question. Okay, so I think that's all that we have time for. But thank you so much for all of your questions and for attending. It was great to see everyone.
Thank you so much, Professor Calm. Wow, that was really great. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to share your work with the East community. Just as a reminder to everyone, this lecture, as well as others, can be found at alumni.williams.edu/virtual. And we hope you'll join us on December 1st with Dr. Gregory Hall, class of '83, who will speak about trust as a key to reducing health disparities in African Americans. Until then, sending love from the Purple Valley to all of you around the world. Thank you for joining us.